Hello, my name is Mia Keene, and I am a member of the Dole Institute's Student Advisory Board, the official student group of the Institute. The Student Advisory Board is a bipartisan group whose members have access to exciting opportunities through their involvement with the Institute. This includes volunteering for evening programs and networking with our special guests. If you are a student and would like to join, please contact us by emailing dolesab@ku.edu. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics, and thank you for attending today's program, presented by the Department of Military History at the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth. After the program, we will have some time for the audience to ask questions. If you have a question, please raise your hand and a student worker with a microphone will come to you. Please stand if you are able and ask just one brief question. The Dole Institute's mission is to foster civil and respectful discussion around important and often difficult topics. Please raise your questions with this in mind. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you all to please turn off your cell phones. And now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sean Halleck, the Director of the Department of Military History.
Thank you. I get the honor of introducing our guest, Dr. Harry Laver. Dr. Laver is a U.S. Civil War historian, but also known for his expertise on Ulysses S. Grant and World War II, specifically Operation Overlord. He got his Bachelor of Arts from North Carolina in zoology, by the way. So if there's any issues with pets or livestock, Harry may be the guy to talk to. MA in North Carolina in history, he gets on the right track, okay? And then a PhD from University of Kentucky. He's a recognized expert on U.S. Grant. He's written 4 books on Grant, Eisenhower, and ultimately military leadership. He is our master instructor and one of the go-to Civil War historians in our department. So he is nationally known, actually internationally known, with Ireland and Indonesia now, right? So he is worldwide, and I get the pleasure of introducing him to talk about the strategy of defense, Abraham Lincoln, and presidential military leadership. So without further ado, Dr. Laver.
Afternoon. Thank you all for coming out on a really nice late summer, early fall. It's certainly not winter, so we're fortunate in that. So thanks for coming out in this really nice weather. And after Election Day yesterday, didn't know how many would show up, what the distraction of that was. So yeah, thanks for coming out for a number of reasons. So today, we're going to talk about President Abraham Lincoln and presidential leadership, specifically his military presidential leadership. And so to get us started on this, what I'd like to do is to go back and join President Lincoln in January of 1862. January of 1862. And we're going to join the president and members of his cabinet along with some representatives from Congress, senators and congressmen from the Joint Committee on the Conduct of the War. And this was a committee Congress formed pretty early in the conflict to sort of advise the president on what they thought was the best path for the country to take in fighting this war. And as this conversation went on, the members of Congress expressed their pretty significant dissatisfaction with General George McClellan. You know McClellan. And his lack of, let's say, energy in prosecuting the war. But as the meeting went on, the congressmen became increasingly concerned because it was becoming clear, as a representative from Indiana, a man named George Julian, remembered, this is what he said, that it had become clear that neither the president nor his advisors seemed to have any definite information of General McClellan's plans. Lincoln himself did not think he had any right to know, but that as he was not a military man, it was his duty to defer to General McClellan. Well, not long after this meeting, the Attorney General, Edward Bates, recalled that he pulled Lincoln aside and said to the president that what the president needed to do was to organize a staff of his own and assume to be, in fact, what you are in law. Command the commanders. You know, in America's history, in our national consciousness, in our collective memory, Abraham Lincoln is seen, and I think rightly so, as the preeminent war leader in our country's past. He was the master politician who just could intuitively understand the consequences of any political decision he made. He was also the poetic wordsmith who could sway an audience with his appeals to the mystic chords of memory and the better angels of our nature. He was the North Star of morality who struck the fatal blow against the institution of slavery. And concerning Lincoln as the commander-in-chief, there's been equal praise for him in that position as well. The legendary Civil War historian from a previous generation, T. Harry Williams, in his book, Lincoln and His Generals, said this: Lincoln stands out as a great war president, probably the greatest in our history, and a great natural strategist, a better one than any of his generals. Well, I don't think there's any doubt that one of Lincoln's greatest challenges in the war was his responsibilities as commander-in-chief of the military forces, and especially in dealing with his generals. Lincoln had to work through a whole cast of characters before Ulysses S. Grant sort of emerged from the crowd later in the war. And it's Lincoln's relationship with his generals that brings me to the point I want to talk with you about today, and that is perhaps Lincoln has been maybe a little overly praised in his role as commander-in-chief, especially on matters of strategy. And this, I would say, is arguably one of the most important responsibilities of the president as commander-in-chief, and that's dealing with strategy. And the shortcoming I'm suggesting that Lincoln had in dealing with his generals makes all the more critical the late rise of Ulysses S. Grant in the war, as we'll talk about in just a moment. You know, another way to think about this is that in military matters, Lincoln was just simply out of his comfort zone. Very different from the realm of legal and constitutional issues of a lawyer. Very different from the circus of party politics where Lincoln was an unquestioned ringmaster. Now, having said that, even though Lincoln had really no formal military training, no formal education, really very little, and he would have acknowledged virtually no military experience whatsoever, he did have an innate, intuitive sense of strategy. And this he enhanced by checking out books from the Library of Congress as soon as he was president-elect, and began reading about strategy, trying to educate himself in this. But he had this intuitive, innate sense about it. And when to be clear, when I'm talking about strategy, I'm talking about the way in which the United States would fight this war comprehensively to defeat the Confederacy and achieve the war objective of maintaining the Union. And I think the best example to illustrate Lincoln's innate, intuitive sense of strategy is something he said, something he wrote early in the war in January of 1862, the same time he had that meeting with members of his cabinet and congressional leaders. And again, January 1862, this is still very early. Fort Sumter had been the previous April. The only battle of major level, I would say, is First Bull Run in January of 1861. And from that point on, yes, there were some engagements, but nothing major. So this is still very early. Little has happened. And it's at this point of the war that Lincoln sits down and pens a letter that he sends to one of his generals, a man named Don Carlos Buell. And in this letter, Lincoln lays out his conception of a strategy to win the war. And I'm going to use this map and then some subsequent ones to illustrate Lincoln's thing. You can see red circle I've got sort of around the Confederacy. And this is what Lincoln said in his letter to General Buell. I state my general idea of this war to be that we have the greater numbers. And I think probably everybody in this crowd could run through a list of the greater numbers Lincoln's referring to: population, industrial capacity, economic capacity, diplomatic capacity. Greater numbers in all of those things is what Lincoln begins by saying. So we have the greater capacity numbers, and the enemy has the greater facility of concentrating forces upon points of collision. That the enemy has the greater facility of concentrating forces on points of collision. And I've now inserted this red arrow inside the circle to represent Lincoln's idea that inside that circle, the Confederates can move forces more quickly to any point on that circle than the North, which has to operate on the exterior of that circle. Today, those of you with any military experience would recognize this as interior lines, our concept of interior lines, an advantage to the person, to the force operating on interior lines. So Lincoln then goes on to say, we must fail unless we can find some way of making our advantage an overmatch for his. Simple enough. We have one advantage, they have another. We have to make ours better. And we must fail unless we can find some way of making our advantage overmatch his, and that this can only be done by menacing him with superior forces at different points at the same time. Multiple simultaneous offensives by using our greater numbers to deny them that advantage of interior lines. Hopefully that makes sense. Well, in the end, this is exactly the strategy that General Grant is going to recommend to Lincoln. But that's not going to come until the spring of 1864, 2 years later from when Lincoln is writing this letter. And until then, Lincoln is going to have to work his way through generals who consistently ignore his ideas, never develop a comprehensive strategy of their own, and instead focus to the exclusion of almost everything else on either capturing the capital of Richmond or winning isolated, separate battles on the battlefield. And Lincoln, rather than pressing his own conception of strategy on his generals, will repeatedly defer to them, as they again demonstrate no strategic understanding or insight that's anywhere near equal to Lincoln's. Lincoln's concept here of menacing with superior forces at different points at the same time, again, we'll see how much aligned he is with General Grant later in the war. Well, the first commander that Lincoln has to deal with, or that does deal with, is this man, General George McClellan, that I mentioned earlier. McClellan was a West Pointer, class of 1846, finished number 2 out of 59, so very high in his class. He did extraordinarily well. And in the Civil War, he won an early battle in July of 1861 at a place called Rich Mountain, western part of Virginia, and that got the attention in Washington. And very shortly after that, Lincoln appointed General McClellan here to be the commander of the Army of the Potomac, the headline army, the army that had the responsibilities of both defending Washington and operating down into Virginia. Well, 3 months later, in November now of 1861, even though McClellan had not really done anything, Lincoln also gave him the responsibility to be general-in-chief of all U.S. forces in the war, the overall commander of everything, along with still responsibilities as Army of the Potomac commander. In notifying McClellan of this, Lincoln said, "This is an immense responsibility for one man to take on." McClellan's response, "I can do it all." Well, an early sign of the deference that Lincoln is going to give to his military commanders comes just 2 weeks after this appointment to General-in-Chief. Lincoln decided he wanted to go and meet with General McClellan to talk about some military matters. So the president, along with the Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, and one of Lincoln's secretaries, a man named John Hay, who recorded this event, went along with Lincoln to McClellan's home there in Washington. When they got there, they were told that the general was out at a wedding, but he was expected back shortly. Lincoln said, "We'll wait." Not long after that, General McClellan did return, came in through the back door, was told the president was in the front parlor waiting, and McClellan went upstairs and went to bed. Now, shortly after, an aide went out and explained to the president that General McClellan had retired for the evening. Lincoln said nothing. Stanton was furious, but Lincoln said nothing and left. Tellingly, from that point forward, Lincoln would ask General McClellan to come to the White House for meetings. But nevertheless, Lincoln did not force the issue at that point. Now, General McClellan here, in spite of his great self-confidence and his disdain for the president, as I mentioned earlier, did not show much motivation at all to start moving the war forward. Lincoln requested twice that McClellan present him plans with making an operation into Virginia. McClellan eventually did supply 2 plans, neither of which the president liked very much. But he gave his approval. And Lincoln's approval is what led then to the Peninsula Campaign in April of 1862. And in this campaign, McClellan did, and we can see on the map, he went by water to the Virginia coast and then up the James River to Richmond. McClellan does get the Union Army to the very outskirts of Richmond. And at that point, he starts sending his messages back to Washington saying that he is significantly outnumbered by the Confederates, more than doubling their number to over 200,000 in Richmond. Lincoln patiently explained he was sending all the reinforcements he possibly could, but General McClellan was going to have to do the best he could with what he had at that point. Well, when the decisive battles came outside of Richmond, when Robert E. Lee took over command, he did not outnumber George McClellan. He did very quickly outmaneuver George McClellan and forced McClellan and the Union Army to retreat away from Richmond and eventually withdraw back to Washington. The fault, of course, was not General McClellan. He wrote back to Washington, "I have lost this battle because my force was too small. The government must not and cannot hold me responsible for the result. The government has not sustained the army. If I save this army now, I tell you plainly that I owe no thanks to you or to any other person in Washington. You have done your best to sacrifice this army." Well, the president continued his deference to General McClellan and kept him in command of the Army of the Potomac. Lincoln did relieve McClellan of his responsibilities as general-in-chief. Lincoln just believed that this campaign confirmed this was too much for one individual, so General McClellan will stay in command of the Army of the Potomac. Now, McClellan did not view, really, the same way. But members of Congress started to pressure Lincoln again. One member saying, "You've got to find anybody to replace McClellan with." And Lincoln responded, "Well, Senator, for you, anybody is good enough, but I have to have somebody." And it was a good point from Lincoln that, who do I replace McClellan with? No one has really emerged. Well, later that fall, of course, McClellan will take the Army of the Potomac into battle once again at Antietam Creek in September. And while we could call it perhaps a victory for the Union forces, Lincoln saw the escape of Lee's army yet again as a missed chance, possibly to end the war, if not seriously damage the Confederate military. McClellan, however, saw it very differently. In a letter to his wife, he said, "I fought this battle splendidly, and it was a masterpiece of art. I have insisted that Secretary of War Stanton shall be removed. Unless these conditions are fulfilled, I will leave the service. Well, a few weeks later, General McClellan did, in fact, leave the service. There's a photograph of the president meeting with General McClellan in the weeks after the Battle of Antietam. You can pick out Lincoln. McClellan is 3 or 4 to the facing Lincoln, looking over in Lincoln's direction. Yes, McClellan did leave the service, but it was at the behest of the president. Lincoln simply had enough. McClellan had not only missed 2 opportunities to inflict significant damage on the Confederates, he also had offered no vision, no strategy to how to win this war in its entirety. As Lincoln put it to a friend, he said, "I've tried too long to bore with an auger, too dull to take hold." As only Lincoln could put something. But Lincoln had to have somebody. And so he turned to this man, General Ambrose Burnside, another West Pointer, class of 1847, number 18 out of 38 cadets. And to Burnside's credit, he did not believe he was up to the job of Army command. And he tried to refuse it, but enough pressure from the president, Burnside agreed. He felt it was his duty to take on the responsibility. He did begin then planning an operation to work his way towards Richmond. Lincoln didn't necessarily like the plan. He saw some potential flaws in it, but he deferred to General Burnside, the military professional. As Burnside began to execute this operation, problems started to arise, fog and friction, and it really wasn't all Burnside's fault. But the delays allowed Robert E. Lee to take up an ideal defensive position on the outskirts of the Virginia town of Fredericksburg. And with that delay and that position, they were in, the Confederates, in almost an impregnable position. Nevertheless, Burnside decided to attack anyway, sending wave after wave of Union infantry washing up against this rock of a Confederate position. They didn't come close to the Confederate lines, let alone achieving any sort of victory. Lincoln had been monitoring reports coming from the front at the telegraph office, and when word came of the outcome of this battle at Fredericksburg, he slumped, shoulders dropped, and he commented that if there is a worse place than hell, I am in it. Well, unlike General McClellan, Burnside, to his credit, took responsibility for this loss at Fredericksburg, but that didn't change the outcome of the battle. It was still a devastating loss, yet again, for the Army of the Potomac. And Lincoln was no closer to victory, no closer to having any sense of how are we going to go about winning this war. And a few weeks later, Lincoln accepted Burnside's resignation from the Army of the Potomac. But Lincoln needed somebody. And so now he turned to this man. Sorry, not this man. Oh, we'll go back. Yes, this man. General Joe Hooker, Fighting Joe Hooker, who had a reputation as a hard fighter, a hard drinker, among other things. And like McClellan, he did not lack for confidence at all. Another West Pointer, class of 1837, 29 out of 50 cadets. And a few months before Lincoln selected Joe Hooker here to command the Army of the Potomac, Hooker told a reporter from the New York Times, "Nothing would go right until we had a dictator, and the sooner the better." Well, now Lincoln had given him command of the premier army of the United States. And in his message to Hooker, giving him command, Lincoln made reference back to this comment to the New York Times reporter. And Lincoln said this, "Of course it was not for this, but in spite of it, that I have given you command. Only those generals who gain successes can set up a dictator. What I ask of you is military success, and I will risk the dictatorship." Well, as with Burnside, Lincoln really seemed to be seeking only battlefield victories. Granted, they were rare enough at this point. But rather than looking for a comprehensive strategy to how do we go about winning this war? Well, after 4 months of preparation, Joe Hooker did set in motion, as we saw a second ago, a plan to move against Robert E. Lee's army, being the objective. Lee, of course, countered as Hooker moved his army deeper into Virginia. And at a place called Chancellorsville, not really a town, simply a crossroads in a forest of small, narrow, winding roads, vine-choked thickets of woods, the two armies met. And over the course of a late afternoon, Robert E. Lee, quite ably assisted by Stonewall Jackson, completely surprised Hooker's army. And that day and over the next few days, Hooker and the army retreated back once again to the safety of Washington. Back in the telegraph office, President Lincoln monitoring reports, and when he receives news of this event at Chancellorsville and the retreat of the army, once again, my God, what will the country say? It would take Lincoln a few weeks, but he would relieve General Hooker of command of the Army of the Potomac, really for his failure to respond sufficiently there at Chancellorsville, and to Hooker's failure to respond sufficiently to the crisis that had developed in late June of 1863. And that crisis was, of course, General Lee's second invasion of the North, this time moving through Virginia all the way up into Pennsylvania. And so now Lincoln turned to somebody else, in this case, Major General George Meade. Meade was from Pennsylvania. Lincoln believed, as Lincoln put it, he would fight well on his own dunghill. General Meade here was another West Pointer, class of 1835, 19 out of 56 cadets. And this was admittedly an extraordinarily difficult position for Meade to take command in. Lee was already in Pennsylvania. He was on the verge of capturing the state capital at Harrisburg when Meade takes command of the army. Well, of course, the armies didn't meet at Harrisburg. Instead, they met at that small Pennsylvania crossroads town of Gettysburg. And there, over 3 days, the two armies battled. And in that fight, Meade exercised competent command. If not creative, at least competent command. And on July the 4th, Lee's army started to retreat out of Pennsylvania. At that point, General Meade issued a congratulatory order to his army, which he said in part this: "Our task is not yet accomplished, and the commanding general looks to the army for greater efforts to drive from our soil every vestige of the invaders." Back to the War Office, where Lincoln is monitoring reports from the battle. And when Meade's congratulatory orders come in, Lincoln once again slumps, saying in part this: "Drive the invaders from our soil." Great God, is that all? Will our generals never get that idea out of their heads? The whole country is our soil. Lincoln encouraged Meade to pursue, to chase down Lee, destroy Lee's army when he had the opportunity. Encouraged, but he did not order Meade to do so. Lincoln, again, was looking for that decisive victory that might bring the war to a close, but it simply was not to be. Meade did not pursue. Well, in responding to the crisis of Lee's invasion, Meade demonstrated again that he was a competent commander, and he would keep his job with the Army of the Potomac for the rest of the war. But at no point would he offer any sort of large strategic vision of how to win this war. So Lincoln still had no overarching strategy. He was still looking for someone to provide direction to this war effort. Now, of all the generals that we've discussed so far, with the exception of George McClellan, every one of them had only the responsibility of commanding that one army, the Army of the Potomac. There were other Union armies out there. They only had that responsibility. They could have made recommendations to Lincoln for an overarching strategy, but none of them did. But from July of 1862, this man, Major General Henry Halleck, had been in the position of General-in-Chief. There was a gap after McClellan had been relieved, but then Lincoln, in July of 1862, named General Henry Halleck here General-in-Chief of all Union forces. Yet again, another professional officer, West Pointer, class of 1839, number 3 out of 31 cadets. And Halleck here was seen as one of the great strategists in the Union Army. His nickname was Old Brains. He had translated works on military strategy from French into English. This was the ideal man now to provide that overall vision to Abraham Lincoln. And when Halleck first took command that summer of 1862, he showed initially some signs of having some ideas of comprehensively how to fight this war. But the Second Battle of Bull Run in August of 1862, another devastating loss inflicted on the Union by Robert E. Lee, it rattled Halleck. And from that point forward in the war, at most he seemed to be able to do was to manage essentially the administration and paperwork in Washington. Lincoln eventually said that Halleck was really a first-rate clerk, which you want something more than that from your general-in-chief. But at this point, equally important, along with Halleck's failures here, is at no point in this did Lincoln sit down and say, General Halleck, give me a strategy to win this war. At no point did Lincoln sit down and say, General Halleck, I have a strategy to win this war. I want you to look at it and consider it and apply it. At no point did Lincoln do that. And so by late 1863, Lincoln has dealt with a number of generals, 4 army commanders, 2 generals-in-chief, still with no idea how to prosecute this war, and to this point not willing to exercise his constitutionally defined authority as commander-in-chief of all military forces. Well, the man Lincoln was looking for had begun the war in pretty relative obscurity, out in Illinois as a colonel commanding the 21st Regiment of Illinois Volunteer Infantry. Ulysses S. Grant. Yet again, another West Pointer, class of 1843, 21 out of 39 cadets was his position. And at the start of the war, after a few relatively minor engagements, in the spring of 1862, as Grant was pushing his army into Mississippi, he was surprised by a Confederate army at a place called Shiloh. It was a 2-day slugging match that witnessed 23,000 casualties, incomprehensible to the country. Everyone assumed that there was a comma or an extra zero or something. It could not be 23,000, and yet again it was. It was still a victory for the Union forces, but it was hard to see. And so back in Washington, rumors started to circulate that Grant's old habit of drinking must have been involved. He must have been drunk. He must have been drinking to have suffered this many casualties. And the demands went out, of course, that Grant had to be relieved of command. Well, Grant at this point was one of the few Union generals who not only was trying to move the war along, he was actually winning some battles. And Lincoln essentially demanded an inquiry. I want to know the facts. What's the evidence of this, of these accusations against Grant? And there was none. And so Lincoln made the decision, Grant's going to stay in command. And as Grant put it, I can't spare this man. He fights. Well, after Shiloh, Grant turned his attention to the capture of Vicksburg. that Mississippi River town that Lincoln believed may well be the key to Union victory in this war. And it would take some time, a number of months, but by July the 4th of 1863, Grant had secured the surrender of Vicksburg. Just before Vicksburg surrendered, Lincoln was having a conversation with the general in Washington. And Lincoln said this about Grant out there in Mississippi. If Grant only does this thing down there, and I don't care so much how, as long as he does it, why, Grant is my man and I am his for the rest of the war. Well, once Vicksburg was captured, a few weeks after, Lincoln sent Grant a letter congratulating him on the success in the capture of Vicksburg. And Lincoln also said this: in the early spring, I thought you should go downriver and join General Banks in Louisiana. And when you turned eastward towards Jackson, I feared it was a mistake. I now wish to make the personal acknowledgement that you were right and I was wrong. By this point, Lincoln could easily have sacked Grant at any point. But he decided to keep Grant in command for good reason. Grant not only was fighting, he was winning battles. And in recognition for that victory, that capture of Vicksburg, Grant received a promotion to command the entire western theater of the war. And with that new assignment came a crisis that had developed in Chattanooga, Tennessee. And their Union Army had essentially become entrapped in Chattanooga and faced the prospect of either starvation or having to surrender to the Confederates. Well, once Grant took command and control of the situation, it took a few weeks, but by late November of 1863, Grant and the army there would drive the Confederates not only away from Chattanooga, but out of Tennessee into northern Georgia. And with that, Grant received a promotion to lieutenant general, 3 stars. Only the second man at that point to hold that permanent rank in the United States Army, the first, of course, being George Washington. Well, with that promotion to lieutenant general, Lincoln had his man, and he pulled Grant to Washington. They met first on March the 9th of 1864, and they immediately connected, confirming this relationship that had building by distance for some time, going back to 1862. And what they realized in a very quickly in conversation is they were on essentially the same page. And when they sat down, Grant laid out his vision for how now to prosecute this war. And this map illustrates what Grant was thinking. And what he laid out for the president was that the Union armies would execute 5 operations in the spring of 1864. 3 of them, Grant didn't expect to produce a lot. One in the Shenandoah Valley, one moving against Mobile, Alabama on the Gulf Coast, and one moving from the coast of Virginia up towards Richmond. Grant didn't expect those would do much. But the other 2 operations, one commanded by William T. Sherman, coming out of Chattanooga, moving towards the rail center at Atlanta. The other, the Army of the Potomac, with Grant along, moving into Virginia, going after Lee's army. Those last 2 were the ones Grant expected to pay off. In explaining this to the president, what Grant said was that those not fighting could help the fighting. And Lincoln responded that he completely understood. Those not skinning could hold a leg. Lincoln went on to say to Grant that this plan reminded him, Lincoln, as Lincoln put it, of my old suggestion, so constantly made and as constantly neglected by Buell, Halleck, and the others, to move at once along the enemy's whole line to take advantage of our superiority in numbers. Now, Lincoln finally had a commander who understood his way of thinking. a man who had a strategic vision, a man who now had earned and deserved deference from the president. Well, the following campaigns would greatly test Lincoln's commitment to his new general-in-chief. When the operations began in early May of 1864, the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River, moving deeper into Virginia, where they very quickly encountered Lee's army in what became known as the Battle of the Wilderness. Brutal fighting for 2 days. And at the end of that battle, Grant sent word back to Washington that there would be no turning back. And that was exactly what Lincoln wanted to hear. No turning back. For the next 3 weeks, Lee and Grant would engage in almost constant battle, moving closer and closer to Richmond. Not the objective, but nevertheless, that's the direction that they headed. And each step of the way, Grant sent word to Lincoln, we are not turning back. And again, what Lincoln wanted to hear. He said at one point, any other general would have retreated, but not General Grant. Farther to the south, of course, Sherman was prosecuting his campaign from Chattanooga, moving towards Atlanta. And on September the 3rd, Sherman captures Atlanta, made in part possible that Lee could not send reinforcements to Georgia because Lee was tied up with Grant, exactly what Grant and Lincoln had been expecting would happen. And of course, the capture of Atlanta was instrumental in Lincoln winning re-election just 2 months later in November of 1864. Well, as president, Lincoln did indeed exhibit exemplary skills in managing the political and the economic, the diplomatic and the moral elements of the war, those areas in which he is the preeminent war commander for the United States. And even in his interaction with his generals, Lincoln did demonstrate a number of worthy qualities of patience and tolerance, understanding, encouragement, cajoling. But all of those outstanding features of Lincoln as commander-in-chief were mitigated by his misplaced deference to his military commanders and his unwillingness to force them to develop a strategy or to force his own strategy on them by his authority that the Constitution gave him. When Grant is elevated to command, there was nothing to suggest that Lincoln was about to make radically different changes in his approach to fighting this war. Lincoln's relationship with Grant became effective, not because Lincoln had informed Grant of a strategy, but because Grant had informed Lincoln of a strategy that Lincoln understood immediately. In other words, Lincoln became an effective commander-in-chief when he found a man who was an effective general-in-chief. What Grant did was to bring strategic focus to the Union war effort in the Lincoln administration after suffering really for 3 years without any coherent direction from the generals. So Lincoln was absolutely right when he picked Grant to be his man for the rest of the war, because Grant indeed had a strategic vision and was willing to execute it. Thank you again for coming out, and we'll be happy to do questions. And the request from here at the Dole Center, please wait for a microphone. Sir, your hand went up, and she's coming up right behind you.
Here I am.
Thank you for your talk. I believe Lincoln would walk over to the War Department telegraph office. It was just on the side of the White House.
Correct.
And you said that Grant would send a message back, I take it a telegraph, to Lincoln. Was there much telegraphing back and forth between Lincoln and any of the generals until Grant? Was there, it seemed to be quite an advantage for both Lincoln and the generals for communication, but was there much?
There was, in fact, from early in the war. There was fairly consistent telegraph communications. But that doesn't mean instantaneous. As an example, during Grant's Vicksburg campaign, he was in telegraph communication with Washington. But what that meant was sending a telegram from where Grant was on the battlefield, and once he's in Mississippi, back across the Mississippi or Louisiana, and then heading north to the nearest telegraph office, which may well have been as far as Columbus, Kentucky. So there is a significant lag there. But, of course, the closer to Washington, the more rapidity you can have of that. So there was communication, but just not, better than horseback, right? But still not that rapid. Okay. I think we got one.
Yeah, I'm just curious, would you agree that perhaps what Lincoln was lacking was not so much strategy, but ego?
Oh, ego. It's a nice question. I might use a different word than ego. Because for Lincoln, and those of you familiar with Lincoln's rise through the political levels, and what he did to gain the Republican nomination in 1860, it had to take some ego to pursue that, right? To rise to that level. There's got to be some degree of ego and significant self-confidence. I think perhaps better for Lincoln's, if we'll say shortcoming in dealing with this, is his lack of confidence. As I made reference, when he's dealing with politics, again, he's the wizard. And party politics especially. Winning the nomination in 1860, he orchestrated that from his home. Candidates did not go to the conventions and that, so he was orchestrating that from his home. So I think it's more just a lack of confidence in himself when he's got, right, every general I mentioned, a West Pointer, years of experience, professional soldiers. It makes sense he would want to defer to them, but their failures just kept mounting. It's more confidence, I think, maybe than ego. Anything else? We'll get you next, sir.
Here you go.
How was Lincoln's plan different when he discussed it with the committee from Scott's Anaconda plan?
Different from, well, Lincoln, for the first meeting I talked about, Lincoln didn't really discuss a plan. At that point, the Representative George Julian from Indiana was saying, Lincoln said, oh, I don't want to know. It's not my place. How was Lincoln's plan different from Scott's Anaconda plan? Lincoln's was focused, I'm going to say, exclusively, not that this was Lincoln's thinking, but his plan of multiple simultaneous offensives was more militarily focused. Scott's plan, those of you familiar with it, the three parts of control the Mississippi River, blockade the Southern Confederacy, and build an army to establish Union control. That's a more comprehensive. Those of you familiar with the elements of national power dime. Scott's plan really incorporated much of that when we think of the blockade as an economic effort moving against the Confederacy. Again, Lincoln understood that. He was laying out his understanding of a military strategy with his letter to Don Carlos Buell. Does that make sense? So there's differences, but not differences that Lincoln didn't understand. Right? Sir, I think you had your hand up. Do you still?
My memory serves me, and sometimes it's erroneous, but nevertheless, I remember a comment that Lincoln allegedly made to McClellan, I think it was McClellan, if you're not using the Army, would you mind if I used it for a while?
He did indeed. Lincoln had some, Lincoln used humor extraordinarily effectively. That being one case. General McClellan didn't think it was all that humorous, but nevertheless the same. In another campaign, one of his generals tells him that he needs more cavalry. He doesn't have enough horses. And this was a commander who had really done nothing as far as campaigning or battles for weeks, if not months. And Lincoln's response was essentially, excuse me for asking, but why are your horses so worn out when you haven't done anything? So he did have a way of using humor to make some very sharp points to his commanders. Anything else? What do we got over here?
could you clear up a confusion for me? You mentioned when Lincoln met Grant that he said, "I like your plan. I've been talking to these guys for this time, and they just ignored it." Earlier, you were saying that he never did put his plan upon them. Do you have any idea how to reconcile those? Did he sort of suggest it, but just not have the oomph to take them on? He had nobody else to replace him with, or was he just saying, "Well, I told him that, but I really hadn't"?
No, I think Lincoln did. When Lincoln makes the comment about this reminds me of a plan that I've been thinking about. Lincoln in that communication specifically identifies Buell, who he wrote the letter to in 1862, and General Halleck, who Lincoln did sit down with Halleck and sort of lay out his conception. That's the point, though, where by that point, General Halleck is just sort of, I'm not making any decisions. I'm just sending messages out and bringing messages in. Others that Lincoln may or may not have laid that out to, I don't think that we have the specific evidence to demonstrate. Lincoln makes reference that there perhaps had been more, but we don't know for certain as we do with those. Okay. Anything else? Oh, one more.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Laver. I have actually a two-part question. Was Lincoln's insecurity rooted in his lack of military service or military experience? And the second one was the deference that he had, or he showed towards his generals, and many who were obviously not up to snuff. Was that based on the idea that there was such a short bench among Union generals who he can rely to or go to? So, thank you.
Yeah, the first part of Lincoln's lack of military experience, perhaps explaining some of his deference. I had no question that he was a politician. He was a lawyer. He had been elected to office. He had not served in the... Lincoln, for a short time, was in the Black Hawk Wars. And as he described it, I fought and I bled and I came away from many battles with the mosquitoes. Right? He was very forthcoming. That was the extent of his military experience. So I think, at least early in the war, it makes sense. Can't fault Lincoln for deferring to these professional officers. George McClellan, the young Napoleon, as he was called. Henry Halleck, old brains, the strategist. It sort of makes sense, but as they start to rack up more and more, then we start to say, what's the problem here? And the second part was, just shout it out.
Was his deference based partly on the fact that there was such a short bench?
Oh, a short bench of Union generals. I think that is in part, at least early, when he keeps McClellan in command. No one else had really emerged. And we can see Lincoln struggling with this when he turns to Ambrose Burnside immediately to replace McClellan. Burnside is saying, "Sir, I'm not really up to this. I don't want to command the army." Others are saying, "Mr. President, Burnside's not up to this. He's not really up to commanding this army." But there were no other takers really at that point. Lincoln did ask Joe Hooker first. Joe Hooker declined politically within the military. He didn't think it would be wise to take command of the army. When Burnside heard that Hooker might be considered, Burnside then says, "Okay, I'll do it," because he and Hooker's were something of rivals. It's all kind of army politics plays into this as well. But yes, it's a short bench. Nobody really emerges until Grant starts to slowly come out of the shadows out west. In the few short minutes we have left, I'm somewhat hesitant to bring this up, but as I was coming in, someone asked me, what would Lincoln say about our current political situation? You can see why I hesitate to bring this up. But just some quick thoughts between that and walking in. You know, when Lincoln became president in 1861, when he gave his initial inaugural address in March of 1861. At that point, the war had not begun. Fort Sumter was still a ways off. But 7 Deep South states had voted to secede. So the country was in crisis, right? Tremendously split. And in his first inaugural address, Lincoln concluded it with a degree of optimism and hope. which is hard to see at that point. But his last paragraph of his first inaugural address, and many of you will recognize, I think, parts of this, he said this: "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We can't be enemies. While passions may have strained, they must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory, stretching from every battlefield and every patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone, all over this broad land, will yet swell the chorus of the Union. When again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." You know, that hope and optimism didn't quite play out, right? So over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans die, mostly at the hands of other Americans. And even after those 4 years of everything the country went through, and those 4 years of what Lincoln went through, in his second inaugural address in March of 1865, everyone could see the war was coming to an end. It would be another month until Lee would surrender to Grant. But even at that point, in closing his second inaugural address, Lincoln somehow had managed to maintain optimism and hope. And he closed that second inaugural address, again, what I think many of you will recognize, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and his widow and his orphan, and to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. And that's maybe what Lincoln might say about our current political situation. Thank you all again for coming out. Very much appreciated. Have a good afternoon.